What happens when the person who built everything gets treated like nothing? Today's story will show you exactly how I turned the tables on a family that forgot who made their comfortable lives possible. If you think family loyalty goes one way, you're about to learn otherwise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 72 years old, I thought I had earned my place at the family table. For over 4 decades, I had been the cornerstone of the Chen family empire, the woman who turned my late husband's small construction business into a multi-million-dollar real estate development company. When Richard passed away 8 years ago, I didn't just inherit his business. I transformed it into something he never could have imagined. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman everyone once dismissed as just Richard's wife had become the architect of their prosperity. While my children were busy playing house and pursuing their hobbies, I was negotiating million-dollar contracts and expanding our portfolio across 3 states. The Chen Development Group wasn't just a business anymore. It was a legacy worth over $47 million, and every penny of it had my fingerprints on it. I lived in the family estate in Westfield, Connecticut, a sprawling colonial mansion that I had personally designed and overseen the construction of 5 years earlier. The house sat on 12 acres of pristine land, with gardens that I tended. Myself, despite having the means to hire an army of landscapers. This wasn't just where I lived. It was the headquarters of everything I had built, the symbol of what determination and intelligence could accomplish when given the chance. My eldest son, James, worked for the company in what could generously be called a supervisory role. At 45, he had the title of Vice President of Operations, though his operations mainly consisted of showing up to board meetings and collecting his substantial salary. His wife, Patricia, had never worked a day in her life, but had strong opinions about how the business should be run, especially when it came to the charitable donations I made to various causes she deemed unnecessary. My daughter, Linda, lived in California with her husband, Marcus, and their 2 teenage children. She had moved there 15 years ago, ostensibly to pursue her art career, though the only thing she seemed to pursue with any consistency was spending the monthly allowance I provided. Linda called herself a sculptor, but the only thing she had ever sculpted was a lifestyle funded entirely by the business I had built. My youngest son, Robert, was perhaps the most disappointing of all. At 38, he bounced between careers like a pinball, always with grand plans and always needing financial assistance to get started. His latest venture was a food truck business that had already consumed over $200,000 of what he called family investment and what I called money down the drain. His wife, Nicole, encouraged these ventures while simultaneously complaining that they couldn't afford the lifestyle they wanted. For years, I had watched my children take and take, always assuming that my generosity was their birthright rather than my choice. They attended company events when it suited them, showed up for board meetings when there were decisions that affected their inheritance, and called me when they needed something. But when it came to actually being a family, to showing up for the woman who had sacrificed her own dreams to build theirs, they were mysteriously unavailable. This pattern had been growing more pronounced over the past few years. Birthdays were acknowledged with perfunctory phone calls. Mother's Day brought expensive flowers ordered online with generic cards. Christmas was a tense affair where everyone gathered at my house, exchanged gifts, and left as quickly as possible to get back to their real lives. I had become the obligation they checked off their list, the elderly mother they tolerated rather than celebrated. I should have seen the Thanksgiving exclusion coming, but perhaps I had been too generous in my assumptions about their character. Perhaps I had mistaken their dependence on my wealth for actual affection. The realization that I had been wrong about something so fundamental would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. I was in my home office, reviewing the quarterly reports. That showed our company had just posted its most profitable year in history, when my phone rang. Linda's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with the warmth I reserved for my children, despite their recent neglect. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, setting aside the financial documents that represented the empire I had built for their benefit. "Hi, Mom." Linda's voice came through with that particular tone she used when she was about to ask for something. "I wanted to call and let you know about our Thanksgiving plans this year." I waited, expecting her to ask what time she should arrive, whether she should bring anything, or perhaps to suggest a different date if the traditional Thursday didn't work for everyone. After all, Thanksgiving at the Westfield estate had been a family tradition for over 2 decades. The dining room could seat 20 people comfortably, and I had always taken pride in hosting the entire extended family for a feast that took me days to prepare. "We're doing something different this year," Linda continued, and I could hear the studied casualness in her voice. "Patricia found this amazing resort in Vermont that does a special Thanksgiving package. You know, all the food is prepared for you, there's entertainment, and the kids can go skiing. It's going to be so much more relaxing than cooking for everyone." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "That sounds lovely, dear. When should I pack?" The silence that followed was perhaps the loudest sound I had ever heard. When Linda finally spoke, her words were careful, measured, as if she had rehearsed them. "Well, the thing is, Mom, it's really designed for families with younger people. You know how you've been talking about your back bothering you, and the resort has a lot of activities that might be too strenuous. Plus, it's quite expensive, and we've already made the reservations." Each word landed like a physical blow. My back, which was perfectly fine, had become their excuse. The expense, which would have been nothing to me, was somehow prohibitive. The activities, which they hadn't bothered to describe, were supposedly too much for a woman who still worked 60-hour weeks and maintained 12 acres of property. "I see," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "And James and Robert are going as well?" "Oh yes, everyone's so excited. James and Patricia are bringing the twins and Robert and Nicole are driving up from Boston. It's going to be like a real family vacation, you know? Something we haven't done in years." "Something we haven't done in years because you've all been too busy with your own lives to make time for family," I thought but didn't say. Instead, I found myself asking, "And what am I supposed to do for Thanksgiving?" Linda's laugh was bright and artificial. "Mom, you're always saying how much work the holidays are for you. This way, you can just relax, maybe order something nice from that restaurant you like. Think of it as a break. A break. From my own family. On the holiday that had always meant the most to me. The day when I had spent decades creating memories and traditions that apparently meant nothing to any of them. I was being given a break from being loved, from being included, from mattering. "Well," I said, surprised by how normal my voice sounded, "I suppose you've thought of everything." "I knew you'd understand, Mom. You're always so reasonable about these things. Oh, and before I forget, could you have accounting transfer my November allowance a few days early? The resort requires full payment up front." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There it was, the real reason for the call. Not to invite me, not to include me, but to ensure that my money would fund the family gathering that I was explicitly excluded from. My reasonable, understanding mother was supposed to pay for the privilege of being left behind. "Of course, dear. I'll have Sarah take care of it first thing tomorrow." "You're the best, Mom. I'll call you after Thanksgiving and tell you all about it." After Thanksgiving. As if I would be sitting by the phone, eagerly waiting to hear about the wonderful time my family had without me. As if the stories of their joy would somehow compensate for my exclusion from it. "That would be lovely," I said. "Have a wonderful time." I ended the call and sat in my office, surrounded by the evidence of everything I had built for them. The quarterly reports showing record profits. The architectural plans for the new development project that would add another $20 million to the company's value, the legal documents that outlined their inheritance, the trust funds that ensured their comfort, the life insurance policies that guaranteed their security. For 43 years, I had been building their future. I had sacrificed my own dreams, my own desires, to create something that would outlast me and provide for generations of Chens to come. I had worked when they played, worried when they slept peacefully, and solved problems they never even knew existed. And now, when I was supposed to enjoy the fruits of that labor, when I was supposed to be surrounded by the family I had provided for, I was being discarded like an employee who had outlived her usefulness. I walked to the window of my office and looked out at the grounds of the estate. The maple trees were in full autumn glory, their leaves a brilliant tapestry of gold and crimson. The gardens I had planted were preparing for winter, the last of the chrysanthemums still blooming, in defiance of the cooling air. This was my sanctuary, the place I had created as a haven for my family, and I would be spending Thanksgiving here alone, while they enjoyed a vacation funded by my generosity. But as I stood there, something began to shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but it was being joined by something else, something harder and more focused. I had spent decades being the reasonable one, the understanding one, the one who put everyone else's needs before her own. I had been the matriarch who gave and gave and gave, never asking for anything in return except love and respect. It was time they learned what happened when they stopped providing even that. I turned away from the window and walked to my desk, where the latest version of my will sat in the top drawer. I had updated it just 6 months ago, ensuring that each of my children would inherit equal shares of the business, the properties, and the liquid assets that comprised the Chen fortune. They would never want for anything. Their children would be provided for, and their children's children would benefit from the empire I had built. But looking at those documents now, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. Why was I rewarding their neglect? Why was I ensuring the comfort of people who couldn't be bothered to ensure mine? What message did it send when the person who built everything was treated as if she had built nothing at all? I opened my laptop and began typing an email to my attorney, Harold Fitzgerald, who had been handling the family's legal affairs for over 15 years. Harold was discreet, efficient, and had no sentimental attachment to my children that might cloud his professional judgment. Harold, I wrote, I need to schedule an appointment to discuss some significant changes to my estate planning documents. When is the earliest you can see me? This is time-sensitive. I sent the email and then did something I hadn't done in years. I poured myself a glass of the 30-year-old scotch that Richard had been saving for a special occasion that never came before his death. I sat in his favorite chair in the library, surrounded by the books we had collected together over the decades of our marriage, and I began to plan. They thought they could exclude me from Thanksgiving. They thought they could treat me as an inconvenience while still expecting to inherit everything I had worked for. They thought that my love for them was unconditional, that my generosity was guaranteed, that my place in their lives was whatever they decided it should be. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next morning, Harold's response was, waiting in my inbox. He could see me that very afternoon, and his tone suggested he understood the urgency. I spent the morning reviewing financial documents, making notes, and preparing for a conversation that would change everything. As I drove to Harold's office in downtown Hartford, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement. For too long, I had been reactive, responding to my children's needs and demands while my own desires took a back seat. Today, I was going to be proactive. Today, I was going to take control of my own story. Harold's office was in one of the older buildings downtown, all dark wood and leather-bound law books that spoke to tradition and stability. He was a man in his 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, who had guided me through the legal complexities of expanding the business and had always treated me with the respect that my own family seemed to have forgotten I deserved. Margaret, he said, rising from behind his mahogany desk as his secretary showed me in. You sounded quite determined in your email. What can I do for you? I settled into the chair across from his desk and placed my handbag carefully beside me. Harold, I need to completely restructure my estate plan. Everything. His eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. May I ask what's prompted this decision? I told him about the Thanksgiving call, about the pattern of neglect that had been building for years, about the realization that I had been enabling their disrespect by continuing to reward it financially. Harold listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the legal pad in front of him. I see, he said when I finished. And what kind of restructuring are you considering? I want to remove my children as beneficiaries of the estate entirely, I said, the words feeling powerful in my mouth. The business, the properties, the investments, the life insurance, all of it. Harold set down his pen and looked at me carefully. Margaret, that's a very significant decision. Have you considered the ramifications? The shock this will cause? The potential for legal challenges? I've considered everything, I replied, and I want to make sure it's ironclad. They need to understand that their inheritance was never guaranteed. It was contingent on them treating me with basic human decency, and they've failed that test. Where would you like the assets to go instead? I had been thinking about this all morning. I want to establish a foundation, the Richard and Margaret Chen Foundation for Educational Excellence. It will provide scholarships for first-generation college students, particularly those from immigrant families who understand the value of hard work and family loyalty. Harold made more notes, his expression thoughtful. That's a beautiful legacy, Margaret. But I have to ask, is this a permanent decision, or are you hoping it might serve as a wake-up call for your children? I considered his question carefully. Was I hoping they would change? Was this an elaborate punishment, designed to bring them back to their senses? Or was I finally accepting the reality of who they had become and making decisions based on that reality, rather than on my hopes for who they might yet be? Harold, I said finally, I'm 72 years old. I don't have time to hope they'll become different people. I need to make decisions based on who they are right now, and right now, they're people who exclude their mother from family gatherings while expecting to inherit her fortune. If they change, truly change, then perhaps I'll reconsider. But that change has to come from them, not from the threat of losing their inheritance. He nodded slowly. All right. When would you like this to take effect? Immediately. I want the new will drafted and executed before Thanksgiving. I want to know that when they're enjoying their family vacation without me, it's the last time they'll do it on my dime. Harold spent the next hour explaining the legal requirements, the documentation needed, and the timeline for completing the changes. We scheduled another appointment for Friday morning to review the final documents, which would give him time to draft everything properly and give me time to make sure I was certain about this decision. As I drove home from Harold's office, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time in decades, I was making decisions based on my own needs and values rather than on my children's expectations. I was taking control of my own narrative instead of allowing them to write me out of theirs. The rest of the week passed in a strange state of suspended animation. James called once to ask about a business matter, but didn't mention Thanksgiving. Robert sent a text asking if I could cover his food truck's insurance payment, which was overdue. Patricia called to complain about something Linda had said during their planning call for the Vermont trip. None of them seemed to notice or care about my unusual quietness. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with the promise of an early winter in the air. I dressed carefully for my appointment with Harold, choosing the navy blue suit I had worn to close the biggest deal in the company's history. If this was the day I was taking control of my legacy, I wanted to look like the formidable businesswoman I had always been. Harold's secretary offered me coffee, which I accepted, and I sat in the waiting area looking through the morning paper. There was an article about family businesses and the challenges of succession planning, and I wondered if the reporter had any idea how complicated those challenges could become when the family itself fell apart. "Margaret?" Harold appeared in the doorway to his office, a thick folder in his hands. "Ready to make history?" The new will was comprehensive and thorough. Harold had included provisions for the Foundation's board of directors, operational guidelines, and specific criteria for scholarship recipients. He had also included a detailed explanation of my reasoning, written in language that would make it nearly impossible for my children to challenge the document successfully. "There's one more thing," Harold said as I reviewed the final pages. "Have you considered how you want them to find out about this?" I looked up from the documents. "What do you mean?" "Well, typically, the contents of a will aren't disclosed until after death. But given the circumstances and given that you hope this might prompt some self-reflection on their part, you might want to consider telling them directly." The idea of confronting them with their loss had occurred to me, but I had dismissed it as unnecessarily dramatic. Now, however, I realized that Harold might be right. If I truly wanted them to understand the consequences of their behavior, they needed to know about those consequences while there was still time for them to matter. "After Thanksgiving," I said, "let them enjoy their vacation. Let them spend my money and celebrate their family unity without me. And then when they come home happy and relaxed, thinking everything will continue as it always has, I'll tell them the truth." Harold nodded approvingly. "That seems fitting." I signed the documents with a sense of finality that was both terrifying and liberating. With a few strokes of my pen, I had fundamentally altered the future of my family, removed the safety net they had always taken for granted, and redirected a fortune toward people who would truly appreciate its value. As I left Harold's office, the signed will secured in my handbag, I realized that I had just done something my children would have considered impossible. I had put my own needs first. I had made a decision based on my own values rather than their expectations. I had finally, after 7 decades of life, learned to say no. Now all that remained was to see what they would do when they learned that their mother, the woman they had excluded from their celebration, had just excluded them from their inheritance. The weekend passed quietly. I spent Saturday in my garden, preparing the flower beds for winter and enjoying the solitude I was learning to appreciate. Sunday. I attended church alone, as I had been doing for months since my children had stopped making even the pretense of joining me for weekly service. Monday brought the first real test of my resolve. James called with a proposal for expanding the company's presence in Florida, a project that would require significant capital investment and his personal relocation to oversee operations. He spoke with the casual confidence of someone who assumed his mother's financial backing was guaranteed, someone who had never questioned whether his inheritance would be there to fund his ambitions. "It's a perfect opportunity, Mom," he said, his voice bright with enthusiasm. "The market down there is exploding, and we could easily double our revenue within 5 years. I've already started looking at houses in Naples. Patricia's excited about the weather." I listened to his plans, his assumptions, his casual expectation that I would fund his Florida dreams, and I felt a calm certainty that I had made the right decision. This was exactly the attitude that had led to my exclusion from Thanksgiving, the assumption that I existed to facilitate their desires without regard for my own feelings or needs. "That sounds very ambitious, James," I said neutrally. "Have you prepared a formal business proposal with projected costs and revenue streams?" He laughed. "Mom, you know I'm good for it. The Chen Development Group has never had a project fail under my supervision." Of course, the Chen Development Group had never had a project succeed under his supervision either, since I had been the one making all the actual decisions while he took credit for the results. But pointing that out would only lead to an argument, and I had better ways to make my point. "Why don't you put together a comprehensive presentation?" I suggested. "Include everything, Market analysis, financial projections, risk assessment. We can discuss it after the holidays. After the holidays. After I had told him that his inheritance was gone and his expensive Florida dreams would have to be funded by his own resources. After he learned that the gravy train he had been riding his entire adult life had finally reached its last station. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in a blur of routine activities. I finalized some business matters, arranged for the house staff to have Thanksgiving off since I would be dining alone, and confirmed my appointment with Harold for the following Monday, when we would begin setting up the foundation. Wednesday evening, I received a flurry of texts from Vermont. Photos of the resort, pictures of my grandchildren skiing, images of the elaborate Thanksgiving spread that the resort was providing. Linda sent a video of the family toasting each other in the resort's dining room, everyone looking relaxed and happy in their beautiful Vermont setting. "Wish you were here," the message accompanying the video said, but we both knew that was a lie. If they had wished I were there, I would have been there. If they had wanted my company, they would have arranged for my company. Instead, they were enjoying the vacation my money had funded while reminding me of everything I was missing. I watched the video once, noted how genuinely happy they all looked without me, and then deleted it. Tomorrow, while they were celebrating their family unity, I would be having Thanksgiving dinner alone in the house I had built for family gatherings that no longer included me. But for the first time in years, I wasn't dreading the solitude. Instead, I was looking forward to the peace. Thursday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the lawn and the last of the autumn leaves clinging stubbornly to the oak trees that lined the driveway. I had slept better than I had in weeks, and I woke with a sense of purpose that surprised me. I spent the morning cooking, not the elaborate feast I usually prepared for 12 or 15 people, but a simple, elegant meal for one. Cornish game hen with herb stuffing, roasted root vegetables from my garden, and a small pumpkin pie that I made from scratch because the ritual of cooking had always been meditative for me. As I worked in the kitchen, I found myself thinking about all the Thanksgivings past, all the years I had spent cooking for people who attended out of obligation rather than joy. How many times had I stressed over the perfect menu, the proper table settings, the elaborate centerpieces, all to impress family members who were counting the minutes until they could leave. This year, I set the table in the breakfast nook instead of the formal dining room. I used my everyday dishes instead of the china that had belonged to my mother. I arranged a simple bouquet of the last chrysanthemums from the garden instead of ordering an expensive floral arrangement. Everything was smaller, simpler, and somehow more authentic than the productions I had been staging for years. At exactly noon, I sat down to my solitary Thanksgiving dinner. I had considered inviting someone, Harold and his wife perhaps, or some of the other widows from church. But ultimately, I decided that this Thanksgiving needed to be about me, learning to be comfortable with my own company, about recognizing that being alone was not the same as being lonely. I raised my glass of wine in a toast to the empty chair across from me. "To new beginnings," I said aloud, and my voice echoed slightly in the quiet room. "To learning the difference between being excluded and choosing solitude. And to the end of rewarding people who don't appreciate what they have." The meal was delicious, perhaps because I had cooked it for someone who truly appreciated the effort. The game hen was perfectly seasoned, the vegetables were tender and flavorful, and the pie was exactly as sweet as I liked it. I ate slowly, savoring each bite and enjoying the silence that was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. After dinner, I took a walk around the grounds, bundled up against the November chill. The estate looked beautiful, in its autumn dormancy, peaceful and dignified in the late afternoon light. This was my sanctuary, the place I had created through decades of hard work and careful planning. Whether I shared it with family or enjoyed it alone, it was mine, and it would always reflect my values and my vision. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I received a call from Linda. I could hear laughter and conversation in the background, the sounds of my family enjoying their celebration without me. "Hi, Mom. We just finished dinner and wanted to call and say Happy Thanksgiving. The food here was incredible, and the kids are having such a great time. I wish you could see them skiing. They're getting so good." I wish you could see them skiing, as if I were somehow unable to travel, somehow incapable of enjoying winter sports, somehow too frail or too boring to be included in family activities. As if my absence was my choice rather than theirs. "That sounds wonderful, dear," I said, my voice warm and pleasant. "I'm so glad you're all having a good time. What did you end up doing today? Did you go to that restaurant you like?" "Actually, I cooked," I said. "A lovely dinner, very peaceful. I've been thinking about a lot of things." "Oh, that's nice. Well, we should probably get back. Robert's telling some story about his food truck that has everyone cracking up, but we'll call you when we get home, okay?" "Of course. Enjoy the rest of your evening." I ended the call and stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the dishes from my solitary meal, and realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore. The hurt was still there, but the rage that had driven me to Harold's office had transformed into something calmer and more resolute. I had made my decision based on clear thinking rather than emotional reaction, and I was comfortable with the consequences. My family was having a wonderful time without me, which proved that they didn't actually need me in their lives. They needed my money, they needed the security I provided, they needed the business I had built, but they didn't need me. And if they didn't need me, then I was free to make decisions based on my own needs rather than theirs. As I cleaned up the kitchen, I thought about the phone call I would make on Monday, the conversation that would change everything. I would invite them all to dinner, just as I had been doing for years. But this time, instead of serving them a meal, I would be serving them a reality they had never imagined possible. The woman they had excluded from their Thanksgiving was about to exclude them from their future. And unlike their decision, mine would have consequences that lasted far beyond a single holiday weekend. Friday morning brought an email that would have made me laugh if it weren't so perfectly predictable. Robert had sent a lengthy message detailing his latest business crisis, complete with spreadsheets showing how close his food truck venture was to bankruptcy and a heartfelt plea for another emergency loan of $50,000 to keep the dream alive. "Mom, I know I've asked for help before, but this is different," his email read. "We're so close to turning the corner. The Thanksgiving weekend was a total wash because we were in Vermont, and now we're behind on rent for the truck's parking space. If we lose that spot, we lose everything. I promise this is the last time I'll need to ask for financial assistance. The last time." I had heard that promise at least 6 times over the past 2 years, and each time Robert had managed to convince himself that his failures were due to circumstances beyond his control rather than his complete lack of business acumen. His food truck served gourmet grilled cheese sandwiches at premium prices, targeting a market that he had never bothered to research and competing against established restaurants with decades of customer loyalty. I forwarded the email to Harold, without comment. He would need to see the kind of financial pressure my children were accustomed to applying, the casual way they assumed my resources were available to cover their mistakes. This wasn't a son asking his mother for help. This was a business partner expecting unlimited funding from an investor who had never agreed to the terms. By Monday afternoon, the family had returned from Vermont, and the photos began appearing on social media. Patricia had posted dozens of images from their weekend, each one more irritating than the last. The family gathered around a beautifully set table at the resort, everyone dressed in coordinated autumn colors like models in a lifestyle magazine. James carving turkey with theatrical precision while the twins applauded. Linda and Marcus toasting each other with expensive wine against the backdrop of snow-covered mountains. But it was the final photo that crystallized everything I had been feeling. The entire family was posed on the resort's grand staircase, arms around each other, faces glowing with happiness and satisfaction. The caption read, "So grateful for family and for the chance to make new traditions together. Sometimes the best Thanksgivings happen when you step outside your comfort zone." Step outside your comfort zone. As if excluding their mother had been a brave adventure rather than a calculated cruelty. As if abandoning decades of family tradition had been growth rather than selfishness. As if my absence had been the thing that made their celebration complete. I screenshot the photo and saved it to a folder on my computer labeled Evidence. Not evidence for any legal proceeding, but evidence for myself. Proof that I had made the right decision. These were not people who missed me, who felt guilty about leaving me behind, or who regretted their choice. These were people who were genuinely happier without me, and I needed to remember that when my resolve wavered. Tuesday evening brought the call I had been expecting. James phoned to ask if I wanted to hear about their trip, his voice bright with the satisfaction of someone who had enjoyed a perfect vacation. He described the resort in detail, the excellent service, the beautiful scenery, and the joy of watching his children experience snow for the first time. "Patricia's already talking about making it an annual tradition," he said enthusiastically. "The kids loved it so much, and it was so much easier than hosting at home. No cooking, no cleaning, no stress. Just pure family time. No stress because I wasn't there to create stress, apparently. No cooking because I wasn't there to demand home-cooked meals. No cleaning because I wasn't there to notice if things weren't perfect. Their ideal family time was family time without me." "It sounds wonderful," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "I'm glad you all enjoyed yourselves." "We really did. And Mom, I wanted to talk to you about that Florida expansion I mentioned. I've been thinking about it the whole weekend, and I'm more convinced than ever that it's the right move. When can we sit down and go over the numbers?" There it was again, the seamless transition from describing how much better their vacation was without me to asking for my financial backing for his dreams. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. I was simultaneously irrelevant to their happiness and essential to their prosperity. "Let's plan something for next week," I said. "I have some things to take care of first, but then we can discuss your proposal in detail." "Perfect. I'll put together a presentation that'll knock your socks off. This is going to be huge, Mom. Really huge." After I hung up, I sat in my home office looking at the quarterly reports that James had never bothered to fully understand. The company's success wasn't due to his vision or leadership. It was due to my careful planning, my strategic investments, and my willingness to make difficult decisions when they were necessary. James had never made a difficult decision in his life, and now he was about to face the most difficult one of all, learning to live without a safety net he had never appreciated. Wednesday brought a surprise visit from Linda, who arrived unannounced, with coffee and pastries from an expensive bakery in Hartford. She breezed into my kitchen with the studied casualness of someone who was trying to soften me up for something, arranging the pastries on one of my good plates and making coffee as if this were a perfectly normal occurrence. "I was in the neighborhood," she lied smoothly, settling into the chair across from me at the kitchen table. "I thought we could catch up properly. Vermont was amazing, but it went by so fast that I feel like I barely talked to anyone. Barely talked to anyone except the family members you actually wanted to spend time with," I thought, but didn't say. Instead, I accepted the coffee she offered and waited for her to reveal the real purpose of her visit. "The resort was incredible," she continued, launching into a detailed description of amenities I would never experience. "The spa was world-class, and they had this amazing art gallery featuring local Vermont artists. It really inspired me. I'm thinking about applying for a residency program they mentioned, something that would let me spend a whole month there next summer working on my sculpture." "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," I said, though we both knew that Linda's sculpture career existed mainly in her imagination and my monthly allowance transfers. "The thing is," she said, finally getting to the point, "the residency requires a significant investment. Not just for the program fees, but for materials, studio rental, accommodation. It's about $30,000 total, but it could really launch my career to the next level." $30,000 to play artist at a Vermont resort while calling it career development. $30,000 so that Linda could extend her fantasy vacation into a month-long retreat from reality. $30,000 because she had enjoyed her Thanksgiving without me so much that she wanted to recreate the experience for an entire summer. "That's quite an investment," I said carefully. "Have you sold any of your recent pieces?" Linda's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "The art market is really challenging right now, Mom. You know that. It takes time to build a reputation, to find the right galleries, to connect with collectors who understand your vision." In other words, no. Linda had not sold any of her recent pieces because Linda's recent pieces, like all of her pieces over the past 15 years, were expensive hobbies rather than marketable art. But she had convinced herself that the problem was the market rather than the product, and now she wanted me to fund another chapter in her self-deception. "Why don't you put together a proposal?" I suggested, borrowing the phrase I had used with James. "Show me examples of your recent work. Include testimonials from galleries or critics, maybe some comparisons to other artists who have benefited from similar residencies. Make it a professional presentation." Linda looked startled, as if the idea of treating her art like an actual business had never occurred to her. Well, I suppose I could do that. But Mom, you've always supported my art. You know how important it is to me." I had always supported her art, which was exactly the problem. I had been writing checks for her artistic dreams for so long that she had stopped thinking of my support as generous and started thinking of it as automatic. She no longer felt the need to prove that her art had value. She simply expected me to continue funding it regardless of results. "Of course your art is important to you," I said gently. "That's exactly why you should be able to present it professionally, to articulate its value and potential. If you're serious about making this a career, you need to be able to convince investors, and I'm essentially an investor in your work." The word investor seemed to make Linda uncomfortable, as if she preferred to think of me as an indulgent mother rather than a businesswoman making calculated decisions about resource allocation. She finished her coffee quickly after that, making vague promises about putting together materials and staying in touch about the residency opportunity. After she left, I realized that none of my children had asked me about my Thanksgiving. They had all called to tell me about their wonderful time, to describe the perfect family memories they had made without me, to request funding for their latest ventures, but not one of them had inquired about how I had spent the holiday I was excluded from. It simply hadn't occurred to them that I might have feelings about being left behind, or that my experience might be worth discussing. Thursday brought the call from Robert that I had been dreading. His voice was tight with panic as he explained that the food truck's landlord was threatening eviction, that his insurance had been canceled for non-payment, and that Nicole was pressuring him to abandon the business entirely and find a real job. "Mom, I'm desperate here," he said, and I could hear the tears in his voice. "I know I've made mistakes, but this business is my dream. It's who I am. If I lose this truck, I lose everything I've worked for. Everything he had worked for, funded, entirely by money I had worked for. The truck, the equipment, the permits, the insurance, the rent, all of it had come from the Chen Development Group's accounts, filtered through me to him in the form of loans that were never repaid and investments that never generated returns. "Robert," I said gently, "what would happen if you couldn't get the money from me? What would you do then?" The question seemed to confuse him. "But you're my mother. Family helps family. That's what you've always taught us." Family helps family. The irony was breathtaking. My family had just demonstrated exactly how they interpreted that principle when they excluded me from their Thanksgiving celebration. Apparently, family helped family only when it was convenient, only when it flowed in one direction, only when it didn't require any sacrifice from the Bao recipients. Have you looked into small business loans? I asked. There are programs for entrepreneurs, grants for minority-owned businesses. Have you explored other funding sources? Those take forever to process, and most of them require collateral I don't have. Mom, I need $50,000 by Friday or I lose everything. You're the only person who can help me. I was the only person who could help him because I was the only person he had ever asked for help. It had never occurred to Robert to build a business that could sustain itself, to develop relationships with banks or investors, or to create value that others might want to support. I was his business plan, his retirement fund, his safety net, and his ATM machine all rolled into one convenient mother-shaped package. Let me think about it, I said. I'll call you tomorrow. Thank you. Mom, I knew you'd come through for me. You always do. I hung up the phone and sat in the gathering darkness of early December, watching the first snow of the season begin to fall outside my office window. Robert was right. I always had come through for him, just as I had always come through for James and Linda and Patricia and all of the grandchildren who barely knew my name but would someday expect to inherit the fruits of my labor. But coming through for them had never required them to come through for me. Supporting their dreams had never translated into support for my needs. Funding their happiness had never generated any concern for my own emotional well-being. I had been the bank that never closed, the investor who never demanded returns, the safety net that never failed. And in return, I had been deemed too inconvenient to include in a family vacation. Friday afternoon, I made the call I had been planning since Tuesday. I dialed James first, then Linda, then Robert, using the conference call feature that I normally reserved for business meetings. When all three were on the line, I could hear the confusion in their voices as they tried to understand why I was calling them together. I wanted to speak to all of you at once, I said, my voice calm and businesslike. I've been thinking about our family dynamics lately, and I've decided to make some changes. What kind of changes? James asked, his tone wary. Well, I've been reviewing the financial support I've been providing to all of you over the years. The business salaries, the monthly allowances, the emergency loans, the investment funding. It's been quite substantial, and I've realized that it may not have been in your best interests. Linda's voice was sharp with alarm. What do you mean, not in our best interests? I mean that perhaps I've been enabling rather than helping. Perhaps by always being available to solve your financial problems, I've prevented you from developing your own problem-solving skills. Perhaps by making your lives too comfortable, I've robbed you of the motivation to build something independently. The silence that followed was profound. I could almost hear them processing the implications of what I was saying, trying to determine if this was a lecture or a threat. Robert was the first to break. Mom, if this is about the $50,000, I understand if you can't do it right now. Maybe we could work out a payment plan, or you could co-sign a loan. This isn't about $50,000, Robert. This is about $50,000 every 6 months for the past 3 years, plus the original investment, plus the ongoing support. This is about the fact that you've built a business model that requires constant infusions of my money to survive. That's not fair, Linda protested. You've always said that family comes first, that we should pursue our dreams. You encouraged my art career. I encouraged your art, Linda. I've been funding your lifestyle. There's a difference between supporting someone's passion and enabling their dependence. James tried to take control of the conversation, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in business meetings. Mom, I think you're overreacting to something. If you're upset about Thanksgiving, we can talk about that separately. but these financial arrangements have been working fine for everyone. Working fine for everyone, I repeated. James, when was the last time any of you asked me if these arrangements were working fine for me? Another silence, longer this time. I've decided to implement some new policies, I continued. Effective immediately, there will be no more emergency loans, no more investment funding for unproven ventures, and no more monthly allowances. The business will continue to pay salaries for actual work performed, but those salaries will be based on industry standards rather than family relationships. The explosion was immediate and overlapping. James demanded to know what had brought this on. Linda accused me of trying to control their lives. Robert began crying as he explained how this would destroy his business and his marriage. All three talked over each other, their voices rising in pitch and volume as they realized that their financial security was evaporating in real time. "Stop," I said, and something in my tone made them fall silent. "You're all adults. You're all intelligent, capable people. You don't need me to fund your lives, and frankly, I'm tired of being treated like an ATM with unconditional access." "Is this because we didn't invite you to Vermont?" Linda asked, her voice small and defensive. "This is because you didn't invite me to Vermont and then called to ask for $30,000 for a summer art residency. This is because you, James, described how much better your vacation was without me and then immediately asked for funding for your Florida expansion. This is because you, Robert, have never once asked me how I'm doing, but you've asked me for money 17 times in the past 2 years." The accuracy of that number seemed to shock Robert into silence. "I've been thinking about what kind of legacy I want to leave," I continued. "And I've realized that I don't want to leave behind children who are financially dependent on their mother at ages 45, 42, and 38. I want to leave behind adults who are capable of taking care of themselves." "So what?" James said, his voice bitter. "You're cutting us off completely? Just like that?" "I'm giving you the gift of independence," I replied. "The gift of knowing that your successes are truly your own. The gift of building something that doesn't rely on my continued existence to sustain it." "This is insane," Patricia's voice came through James's phone, shrill with panic. "You can't just destroy the family's financial stability because you're upset about one vacation." "Patricia," I said, my voice deadly calm, "you weren't invited to this conversation. And the family's financial stability that you're worried about? It's my financial stability. The money you're all spending is money I earned. The businesses you're running are businesses I built. The lifestyles you're enjoying are lifestyles I'm funding. Perhaps it's time you all learned the difference between what belongs to you and what belongs to me." The call deteriorated rapidly. After that, James threatened to quit the company unless I reinstated his previous compensation package. Linda accused me of betraying everything our family stood for. Robert simply sobbed, repeating over and over that I was destroying his life. But what struck me most was that not one of them apologized for excluding me from Thanksgiving. Not one of them acknowledged that their treatment of me might have contributed to my decision. Not one of them seemed to understand that their mother might have feelings that mattered, needs that deserved consideration, or dignity that required respect. They were upset about losing their funding, not about losing their relationship with me. They were panicked about their financial future, not concerned about my emotional well-being. Even in this moment of crisis, even when confronted with the consequences of their behavior, they remained focused entirely on what I could provide for them rather than what they could offer to me. I ended the call without saying goodbye. Saturday morning brought a parade of visitors to my front door. James arrived first, his face flushed with anger and determination. He strode into my living room without waiting for an invitation, carrying a briefcase full of documents that he spread across my coffee table with theatrical precision. "I've been going over the company's financial structure," he announced, "and I think you've forgotten some important facts about how this business operates." I settled into my favorite armchair and watched him arrange his papers with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to deliver a devastating argument. "First," he said, pointing to a balance sheet, "my salary isn't charity. I'm a vice president of a major corporation, and I'm actually underpaid compared to industry standards. Second, the Florida expansion isn't some whim. It's a strategic investment that will benefit the entire company. And third, cutting off financial support to your children isn't independence. It's cruelty." I examined the documents he had brought, noting the highlighted sections where he had calculated his value to the company based on metrics that bore no relationship to reality. According to James's analysis, he was responsible for 90% of our recent growth, despite the fact that he had never closed a major deal or initiated a successful project. "James," I said gently, "who do you think prepared these financial reports that you're quoting to me?" He looked confused. "The accounting department." "And who do you think hired the accounting department, reviews their work, and signs off on their reports?" His confidence wavered slightly as he realized that he was using my own analysis to argue against my own decisions. "The point is," he said, regrouping, "you're making emotional decisions based on one stupid vacation. Patricia feels terrible about the whole Vermont thing. We all do. But you can't punish the entire family's future because of one misunderstanding. One misunderstanding. As if decades of being taken for granted could be dismissed as a simple miscommunication. As if the pattern of neglect that had led to my exclusion from Thanksgiving was just an unfortunate accident rather than a reflection of how they truly viewed my place in their lives. "James," I said, my voice patient but firm, "this isn't about Vermont. Vermont was simply the moment when I realized what had been true for years, that you all value my money more than my company, that you see me as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be loved." "That's not true," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "When was the last time you called me just to talk? Not to ask for something, not to report a business matter, not to fulfill an obligation, but just because you wanted to hear my voice?" James opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The silence stretched between us as he realized he couldn't remember such a conversation. "When was the last time you invited me to do something with you and Patricia and the twins?" "Something. That wasn't a formal family gathering? Something that was just for fun?" Again, silence. "When was the last time you asked me about my hopes, my dreams, my concerns, my fears? When was the last time you treated me like a person rather than like a bank?" James's shoulders sagged as the weight of my questions settled on him. For the first time in our conversation, he looked genuinely sad rather than angry. "I never thought," he began, then stopped. "You never thought, because you never had to think. My love, my support, my money, it was all just there, as reliable as gravity. And because it was always there, you stopped noticing it. You stopped appreciating it. You stopped reciprocating it." He gathered his papers slowly, the fight gone out of him. "So what happens now? Do we just stop being a family?" "We become a different kind of family," I said. "One where relationships are based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. One where love is expressed through presence and attention rather than just checks and transfers. One where everyone contributes something instead of just taking." After he left, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The conversation with James had been painful but necessary, a surgical removal of illusions that had been festering for years. He would either rise to meet this new reality or he wouldn't, but at least he would finally understand what that reality was. Linda arrived that afternoon with red eyes and a trembling voice, looking more fragile than I had seen her in years. She sat on the edge of my sofa as if she might need to flee at any moment, her hands twisted together in her lap. "Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I need you to understand something. My art isn't just a hobby. It's who I am. Without it, I don't know who I am. I looked at my daughter, this 42-year-old woman who had never learned to define herself by anything other than her dreams, and I felt a profound sadness for the ways in which my generosity had stunted her growth. "Linda," I said gently, "if your art is truly who you are, then it shouldn't require my constant financial support to exist. Real artists throughout history have found ways to create, despite poverty, despite rejection, despite every obstacle imaginable. They created because they had to, because something inside them demanded expression regardless of external circumstances." "But you've always believed in me," she said, tears beginning to fall. "You've always said that art matters, that beauty matters, that creativity matters. I still believe all of those things, but I've realized that believing in your art and funding your lifestyle are two different things. I can support your creativity without supporting your refusal to engage with economic reality." Linda's tears turned into sobs. "You're destroying everything I've worked for." "No, sweetheart. I'm asking you to work for something. For the first time in your adult life, I'm asking you to build something that doesn't depend on my monthly checks. I'm asking you to discover what your art is worth in the real world, not just in the world of your mother's indulgence." She left without saying goodbye, and I knew that she might not speak to me again for months. Linda had always been the most emotionally volatile of my children, and she would interpret this boundary as a betrayal rather than a gift. But perhaps in time, she would understand that I had given her something more valuable than money. I had given her the opportunity to discover her own strength. Robert came last, arriving just as the sun was setting on what had been one of the most difficult days of my life. He looked defeated before he even sat down, his shoulders slumped and his eyes hollow with despair. "Mom," he said, "I lost the truck today. The landlord came and took the keys. Nicole packed up and went to her sister's. I have nothing left." I wanted to comfort him, to write him a check, to solve his problems as I had been doing for years. But I forced myself to sit still, to let him feel the full weight of consequences that I had been shielding him from. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "What are you going to do now?" He looked up at me with surprise, as if he had expected me to immediately offer a solution. I don't know. I've never had to figure things out on my own before." It was the most honest thing Robert had said to me in years. "Maybe that's the problem," I said gently. "Maybe the reason you keep failing isn't because you're unlucky or because the market is difficult. Maybe it's because you've never had to develop the skills that come from struggling, from failing without a safety net, from having to create your own solutions." "So you're just going to let me lose everything?" "Robert, you never had everything. You had the illusion of everything, funded by my money. Now you have the opportunity to build something real, something that belongs to you, something that doesn't depend on your mother's continued existence." He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, but somehow more authentic. "I'm scared, Mom. I don't know how to be an adult without you taking care of me." It was the most vulnerable thing any of my children had said to me in years, and it broke my heart even as it confirmed that I had made the right decision. "I know you're scared," I said. "But fear can be a teacher if you let it. Fear can motivate you to develop skills you never knew you had. Fear can show you what really matters when everything else is stripped away. Will you still love me if I fail?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that this was what Robert had really been asking all along. Not for money, not for solutions, but for the assurance that my love wasn't conditional on his success. "I will love you no matter what happens," I said. "But Robert, my love for you isn't the same thing as my funding for your failures. I can love you and still refuse to enable your dependence. I can support you emotionally while requiring you to support yourself financially." He nodded slowly, as if he was beginning to understand a distinction that had been invisible to him before. "I want to try," he said finally. "I want to try to be the kind of man you can be proud of, not just the kind of son you feel sorry for." After Robert left, I sat alone in my living room, emotionally exhausted, but strangely peaceful. In one day, I had dismantled the financial structure that had defined my family relationships for decades. I had stripped away the illusions, the dependencies, and the unspoken contracts that had kept us trapped in patterns of dysfunction. Tomorrow, they would begin learning to live without my constant support. Tomorrow, they would start discovering who they really were when they couldn't rely on my money to cushion their failures and fund their dreams. Tomorrow, they would begin the difficult work of building authentic relationships with me based on mutual respect rather than financial need. And tomorrow, I would begin the process of revealing the final consequence of their choices, the truth about what would happen to the fortune they had always assumed would be theirs. The will that removed them as beneficiaries was just the beginning. Now they would learn that excluding me from their lives meant more than missing one Thanksgiving dinner. It meant losing everything they had never appreciated in the first place. The week following my financial ultimatum passed in an eerie silence that felt like the calm before a hurricane. None of my children called, no text messages appeared on my phone, and for the first time in years, my email inbox wasn't filled with requests for money or complaints about their various struggles. It was as if I had suddenly become invisible to them, which would have been ironic if it weren't so predictable. I spent those quiet days reorganizing my life around my own needs rather than their demands. I scheduled a massage for the first time in months, made dinner reservations at restaurants I had always wanted to try, and called old friends whose invitations I had declined because I was always managing some crisis for one of my children. It was remarkable how much time I had when I wasn't constantly solving problems that weren't mine to solve. On Wednesday morning, I received an unexpected phone call from my sister-in-law, Catherine, Richard's younger sister who lived in Boston. Catherine had always been the family diplomat, the one who smoothed over conflicts and maintained connections, even when relationships grew strained. She was calling, she said, because she was concerned about some things she had been hearing. "Margaret, dear," Catherine said in her carefully modulated voice, "I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I had coffee with Patricia yesterday, and she seemed quite upset about some family disagreements." I settled back in my desk chair, curious to hear Patricia's version of events. "What did she tell you?" "Well, she was rather emotional, so I may not have all the details correct, but she seemed to think there had been some kind of misunderstanding about Thanksgiving, and now you're reconsidering the children's inheritance as some sort of punishment." The word punishment was interesting. Not consequences, not natural results of their behavior, but punishment. As if I were a vindictive parent taking away toys rather than a businesswoman reassessing failed investments. "Catherine," I said carefully, "what exactly did Patricia say about Thanksgiving?" There was a pause, and I could hear Catherine choosing her words diplomatically. She mentioned that they had decided to try something different this year, to take the pressure off you from hosting such a large gathering. She said they thought you might enjoy having a quiet holiday for once, but now you seem to have misinterpreted their consideration as rejection. Their consideration. I had to admire Patricia's ability to reframe abandonment as thoughtfulness, to transform exclusion into gift-giving. According to this narrative, they hadn't left me behind. They had liberated me from the burden of their company. And what did she say about the inheritance? She was quite distressed about that. She said you've threatened to disinherit the children because they didn't invite you to Vermont, which seems rather extreme. She's worried that you might be having some kind of emotional crisis, perhaps related to grief or depression. She suggested that maybe you should speak to someone professionally. There it was, The nuclear option in family conflicts. When all else failed, question the mental health of the person whose behavior you couldn't control. Patricia was suggesting that my decision to stop funding their lives was evidence of psychological instability rather than rational business judgment. "Catherine," I said, my voice remaining calm, "did Patricia mention anything about the financial support I've been providing to the family over the years?" "She did say something about business arrangements, but she seemed to think those were separate from the inheritance issue. She said you've been generous with loans and investments, but that those were family obligations, not favors." Family obligations. Not generosity, not choice, but obligations that I apparently owed them simply by virtue of being their mother and having money they wanted. This perspective explained so much about their behavior. Their casual assumption that my resources were theirs to access. Their complete lack of gratitude for support they viewed as their due. "I appreciate your concern, Catherine," I said. "But I want you to know that I'm thinking more clearly now than I have in years. Sometimes what looks like generosity is actually enabling, and sometimes what feels like love is actually fear of being unloved." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, I know the children can be thoughtless sometimes, but they do love you. They're just young and caught up in their own lives." Young. James was 45 years old, Linda was 42, and Robert was 38. If they were still too young to consider their mother's feelings, then perhaps they were also too young to inherit a fortune built by someone who had learned to consider consequences decades earlier. "I know you mean well, Catherine," I said, "but I need you to understand something. This isn't about one holiday or one disagreement. This is about patterns of behavior that have been developing for years. It's about respect, appreciation, and the difference between loving someone for who they are and loving them for what they can provide." After I hung up with Catherine, I realized that my children were beginning to mobilize allies, to build a narrative that would justify their behavior and pathologize mine. They were creating a story in which they were the victims of their mother's irrational demands rather than the beneficiaries of her decades of sacrifice. It was a sophisticated form of manipulation, and it might have worked if I hadn't already made my decision based on clear-eyed assessment rather than emotional reaction. Thursday brought a more direct assault. I answered my front door to find Patricia standing on my porch, dressed in what I recognized as her serious conversation outfit, a tailored black suit that she wore to parent-teacher conferences and other occasions when she needed to project authority. She was carrying a manila folder, and her expression was a mixture of determination and barely concealed hostility. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, pushing past me into the foyer. "This situation has gone far enough." I followed her into the living room, where she arranged herself on my sofa with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to deliver a decisive argument. She opened her folder and withdrew several documents, spreading them across my coffee table with theatrical precision. "I've been doing some research," Patricia announced, "and I think you need to understand the legal implications of what you're proposing to do." I glanced at the documents, noting printouts from legal websites about estate planning, inheritance law, and what appeared to be information about contesting wills. Patricia had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this confrontation, gathering ammunition for a battle she was determined to win. "The first thing you need to know," she continued, "is that disinheriting your children without cause can be successfully challenged in court, especially if there's evidence of emotional instability or undue influence from outside parties." Emotional instability. There was that theme again, the suggestion that my rational business decisions were actually symptoms of mental decline. I wondered if Patricia understood how insulting it was to suggest that a woman who had built a multi-million-dollar empire was suddenly too unstable to manage her own affairs. "The second thing," Patricia continued, is that your business partners and financial advisors could be held liable if they assist you in making decisions that aren't in your best interests. Harold Fitzgerald, for instance, could face professional sanctions if he helps you execute a will that's clearly the result of family manipulation or psychological pressure. It was a clever threat, suggesting that my attorney could be punished for following my instructions if those instructions could be characterized as irrational. Patricia was essentially arguing that my decision to control my own money was evidence that I was unfit to control my own money. And finally, she said, pulling out what appeared to be a psychological evaluation form, I've arranged for Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a respected geriatric psychiatrist, to conduct a competency assessment. She can see you as early as next week. Once we have documentation that you're making these decisions under emotional duress, we can work together to develop a more rational approach to family finances. I studied Patricia's face as she delivered this ultimatum, noting the confidence in her expression, the way she had positioned herself as the reasonable adult dealing with a confused elderly relative. She genuinely believed that she had cornered me, that her legal research and psychiatric consultations had given her the weapons she needed to force me back into compliance. "Patricia," I said, my voice carefully controlled, "let me make sure. I understand your position. You believe that a woman who built a successful business from nothing, who increased its value by over 3,000%, who has been making complex financial decisions for 4 decades, is suddenly incompetent to decide how her own money should be distributed. I believe," Patricia said carefully, "that grief and isolation can affect anyone's judgment, regardless of their previous capabilities. I believe that family conflicts can create emotional blind spots that prevent people from making decisions that are truly in their best interests. And you believe that my best interests are served by continuing to fund the lifestyle of people who exclude me from family gatherings while expecting me to pay for their vacations." Patricia's composure cracked slightly. "That's not what happened. We made a reasonable decision to try something different for Thanksgiving, and you've blown it completely out of proportion. You're punishing the entire family because you didn't get your way about one holiday." "One holiday," I repeated. "Patricia, when was the last time James invited me to dinner at your house? Not a family obligation, not a birthday or holiday, just dinner because he wanted to spend time with me?" She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. "When was the last time any of you called to ask about my day, my health, my concerns, my happiness? When was the last time any of you offered to help me with something instead of asking me to help you?" Patricia's face was flushing now, her carefully prepared arguments crumbling under the weight of questions she couldn't answer. "When was the last time any of you treated me like a person you love instead of like a resource you manage?" "That's not fair," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We've been busy with our own lives, our own responsibilities. That doesn't mean we don't love you." "No," I agreed, "but it does mean you don't show love in any way that I can recognize. And if you can't show love, if you can't demonstrate respect, if you can't even include me in family gatherings, then perhaps you don't deserve to inherit the results of my love and respect and hard work." Patricia gathered her documents with shaking hands, her psychological evaluation plan clearly not having proceeded as she had hoped. "This isn't over, Margaret. If you're determined to destroy this family's future out of spite, we'll have to take steps to protect ourselves. Take whatever steps you feel are necessary," I said calmly. "But understand that every legal challenge, every psychiatric evaluation, every attempt to declare me incompetent will be documented and considered as evidence of your character when I make my final decisions about the estate." After Patricia left, I called Harold to warn him about the potential legal pressure he might face. He listened to my account of Patricia's threats with professional calm, occasionally making notes on what I assumed was a legal pad. "Margaret," he said when I finished, "I want you to know that everything we've discussed and everything we've documented has been entirely within your legal rights and mental capacity. I've been practicing law for 35 years, and I've never had a clearer-minded client or a more straightforward estate planning case. What about Patricia's threats regarding professional sanctions? Harold laughed, a sound I rarely heard from him. Patricia doesn't understand how legal ethics work. My obligation is to my client's wishes, not to her family's financial expectations. As long as you're competent, which you clearly are, and as long as your instructions are legal, which they are, I have both the right and the responsibility to execute your estate plan exactly as you direct. And the competency assessment, she mentioned? You're under no obligation to submit to any psychological evaluation unless a court orders it, which would require them to present evidence of incompetence that simply doesn't exist. Your business records, your recent decisions, your clear articulation of your reasoning, all of that contradicts any claim of mental instability. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. In her eagerness to intimidate me, Patricia had overplayed her hand, revealing the weakness of her position while strengthening mine. Her threats were empty, her legal research was superficial, and her psychological manipulation was transparent to anyone with professional experience in these matters. Friday brought an unexpected ally in the form of Margaret's longtime housekeeper, Elena Rodriguez, who had been working for the family for over 15 years. Elena had always been discreet about family matters, maintaining professional boundaries while providing reliable service and genuine warmth. But on this particular morning, as she prepared to leave after her weekly cleaning, she approached me, with obvious concern. "Mrs. Chen," she said hesitantly, "I hope you don't mind me saying something, but I've been worried about you." I looked up from the business correspondence I had been reviewing, surprised by the personal nature of her comment. Elena rarely spoke about anything other than household matters, and her expression suggested that whatever she wanted to say was weighing heavily on her mind. "What are you worried about, Elena?" She sat down carefully on the edge of the chair, across from my desk, her hands folded in her lap. "I've been working for families for 25 years, and I've seen how these things go. I've seen what happens when children take their parents for granted, when they think the money will always be there no matter how they behave." I set aside my papers, giving Elena my full attention. Her perspective as someone who had observed my family dynamics from the outside might be more valuable than any advice I could get from relatives or friends who were emotionally invested in the outcome. "Mrs. Chen, I've watched your children for 15 years. I've seen how they talk to you, how they treat your house, how they act when they think no one is listening. And I need you to know that what you're doing, standing up for yourself, it's not wrong. It's overdue." The validation from Elena hit me more powerfully than I had expected. Here was someone who had no financial stake in my decisions, no inheritance, to protect or lose, no agenda other than genuine concern for my well-being. Her support carried a weight that all of Patricia's legal threats could not undermine. "I've seen Mrs. Patricia go through your desk when you're in the garden," Elena continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've heard Mr. James on the phone, talking about how much money he can get from you for his projects. I've watched Miss Linda take things from your house, small things, valuable things, without asking." Each revelation was like a physical blow, confirming suspicions I had pushed. Aside for years, I had known that my children felt entitled to my resources, but I hadn't realized the extent to which they had been treating my home, my possessions, and my privacy as their own. "Why are you telling me this now, Elena?" She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because yesterday Mrs. Patricia called me. She wanted to know about your behavior lately, whether you've been acting strange or confused. She wanted me to say that you've been forgetful or emotional, things that aren't true. She offered to pay me to provide information for some kind of medical evaluation." The breath left my lungs in a rush. Patricia hadn't just threatened to have me declared incompetent. She had attempted to bribe my employee to provide false testimony supporting that claim. It was a level of manipulation and betrayal that I hadn't imagined even Patricia was capable of. What did you tell her? I told her that you're the smartest, strongest woman I know, and that anyone who thinks otherwise doesn't know you at all. Then I hung up on her. Elena's loyalty and integrity were humbling. This woman, who had far more to lose from opposing my children than from supporting them, had chosen to stand with truth rather than expedience. Her courage put my own family's cowardice into sharp perspective. Elena, I want you to know that no matter what happens with my family, your position here is secure. In fact, I'm increasing your salary, effective immediately. And I want you to document any further contact from my children about my behavior or mental state. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. But I don't need more money. I just need you to know that some people see what's really happening here, and some people think you're doing exactly the right thing. That afternoon, I received a phone call that would change everything. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard a voice that I hadn't heard in over 2 years. Hello, grandmother. It was my granddaughter, Jessica, James and Patricia's eldest child, who had just turned 22 and was finishing her senior year at Columbia University. Jessica had always been the most thoughtful of my grandchildren, the one who remembered birthdays and sent thank you notes and actually listened when adults were speaking. But since starting college, our contact had dwindled to holiday pleasantries and brief conversations during family gatherings. Jessica, I said, genuinely pleased to hear from her. What a wonderful surprise. How are your classes going? They're fine, grandmother, but that's not why I'm calling. I need to talk to you about what's happening with the family. My heart sank. Had Patricia recruited Jessica to join the campaign to declare me incompetent? Was this 22-year-old going to lecture me about family loyalty and financial responsibility? I'm listening, I said carefully. Grandmother, I want you to know that I think what you're doing is completely justified, and I'm ashamed of how my parents and aunt and uncle have been treating you. The words were so unexpected that I had to ask her to repeat them. I said I'm ashamed of them, and I want you to know that not everyone in this family thinks you're wrong. Jessica went on to explain that she had been home for Thanksgiving break when the Vermont trip was being planned, and that she had questioned why I wasn't being invited. According to Jessica, Patricia had explained that I was getting old, and that family vacations were for the younger generation now. I asked if anyone had actually talked to you about this, Jessica said, and Mom got defensive and said that some things didn't need to be discussed, that you would understand. But grandmother, I could tell from your voice when I called you on Thanksgiving that you didn't understand. You sounded hurt. Jessica had called me on Thanksgiving. I remembered the brief conversation, the careful way she had asked about my holiday, the concern in her voice when I explained that I was spending the day alone. At the time, I had assumed her concern was polite courtesy, but apparently she had been genuinely worried about my well-being. When I got back to school, Jessica continued, I kept thinking about it. And then this week, Dad called me and started ranting about how you were trying to destroy the family financially, how you were having some kind of breakdown and needed professional help. He wanted me to call you and try to talk sense into you. And what did you tell him? I told him that maybe if he had included you in family decisions, you wouldn't be making decisions without including him. I told him that treating someone like they don't matter and then expecting them to fund your lifestyle was hypocritical. I told him that you've earned the right to spend your money however you want. Jessica's words were like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in family dysfunction. Here was a member of the younger generation who understood basic concepts of respect and reciprocity that her parents had somehow failed to grasp. Grandmother, I want you to know something else. I've been working part-time jobs since I was 16, and I've been saving money for graduate school. I don't want any inheritance from you. I want to build my own life with my own resources, and I think my cousins should do the same thing. The maturity and independence in Jessica's voice made me proud and sad at the same time. This young woman had learned values that her parents had never taught her, had developed a work ethic that her father had never modeled, had acquired wisdom that her entire family seemed to lack. "What are you planning to do after graduation, Jessica?" "I'm applying for graduate programs in social work. I want to help families who are struggling with poverty and addiction and abuse. I want to work with people who appreciate help when they get it." I felt tears forming in my eyes as I listened to this remarkable young woman describe her plans to serve others rather than to be served by them. Jessica had somehow escaped the entitlement that had infected her parents and their siblings, had somehow learned to value contribution over consumption. "Jessica, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If I were to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in social service, would you be interested in serving on the selection committee?" There was a long pause before she answered. "Are you talking about the inheritance money?" "I'm talking about money that was always mine to distribute as I see fit. Money that I've decided should go to people who will use it to help others rather than to help themselves. Grandmother, are you really disinheriting Dad and Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert?" The directness of her question deserved an honest answer. "Yes, I am." Another pause, longer this time. "Good," she said finally. "Maybe it will teach them something about consequences." The conversation with Jessica continued for another hour, during which she told me about her classes, her volunteer work at a homeless shelter, her plans for graduate school, and her concerns about her family's financial dependence on me. She had apparently been worried for years about the effect of my generosity on her relatives' character development, but had felt powerless to address the issue as the youngest member of the family. "Grandmother," she said as our conversation was winding down, "would it be okay if I came to visit you sometime soon? Not for a family gathering or a holiday, just to spend time with you." The invitation was so simple, so genuine, so free of ulterior motives that I had to fight back tears. When was the last time anyone in my family had wanted to spend time with me just for the pleasure of my company? I would love that, Jessica. I would love that more than you can imagine. After I hung up with Jessica, I sat in my office feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, hope for the future of my family. Not hope that my children would change, I was past that particular delusion, but hope that the next generation might be different. Hope that values could skip a generation, that wisdom could emerge from dysfunction, that love could survive even the worst examples of selfishness and entitlement. I opened my laptop and began drafting an amendment to the new will Harold was preparing. Jessica had proven that blood relationship didn't guarantee character, but it also didn't preclude it. She deserved to be recognized for her integrity, her independence, and her commitment to serving others. She deserved to inherit something more valuable than money. She deserved to inherit the responsibility of continuing a legacy of generosity and service. That evening, I received one final phone call that completed the picture of who my family really was. The caller was Marcus, Linda's husband, who had never called me directly in the 15 years he had been married to my daughter. Marcus was a mild-mannered man who worked as a high school mathematics teacher and had always seemed overwhelmed by the financial discussions that dominated Chen family gatherings. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice nervous but determined. "I hope you don't mind me calling, but I felt like I needed to say something about what's been happening." I settled back in my chair, curious about what perspective Marcus might offer. As an outsider who had married into the family, he might have insights that the blood relatives lacked. "I want you to know," Marcus continued, "that I never agreed with the way Linda and the others have been treating you. I've been telling Linda for years that she needs to appreciate what you've done for us, but she always said that you liked being needed, that helping us made you happy." It was a revealing comment. Linda had apparently convinced herself that my generosity was selfish, that I gave money because it made me feel important rather than because I loved my family. It was a convenient rationalization that allowed her to take without feeling guilty. Marcus, what do you think Linda will do now that the financial support has ended? There was a long pause. Honestly, I think it might be the best thing that could happen to her. Linda is incredibly talented, but she's never had to develop discipline or persistence because she's always known that you would cover her expenses if her art didn't sell. Maybe now she'll finally learn to create work that other people value, not just work that expresses her feelings. Marcus's analysis was more insightful than anything I had heard from my own children. He understood that my generosity had been enabling rather than helping, that financial security without accountability had stunted Linda's growth as both an artist and a person. There's something else, Marcus said. Linda has been talking about moving back east, closer to you. But Mrs. Chen, I need you to know that she's not talking about rebuilding your relationship. She's talking about wearing you down, making you feel guilty until you restore her allowance. She thinks this is just a phase you're going through. The honesty in Marcus's voice was both painful and necessary. He was confirming what I had already suspected, that my children viewed my boundary setting as temporary resistance to be overcome rather than permanent change to be respected. What are you going to do, Marcus? I'm going to stay in California with or without Linda. I have a good job here, friends, a life that doesn't depend on anyone else's money. I've been trying to get Linda to build that kind of life too, but she's always preferred the easy path. Maybe now she'll finally understand that the easy path isn't really a path at all. After Marcus hung up, I realized that the battle lines were now clearly drawn. On one side were my children and Patricia, united in their belief that I owed them financial support regardless of how they treated me. They were prepared to use legal challenges, psychological evaluations, and emotional manipulation to force me back into compliance with their expectations. On the other side were people like Elena, Jessica, and Marcus, individuals who understood that respect was a prerequisite for relationship, that love required reciprocity, and that inheritance was a privilege to be earned rather than an entitlement, to be claimed. The week had revealed the true nature of everyone in my orbit, stripping away the polite facades and family obligations to expose the authentic character underneath. Some had disappointed me profoundly, confirming my worst fears about the people I had devoted my life to supporting. Others had surprised me with their integrity and courage, offering hope that my legacy might eventually rest in worthy hands. As I prepared for bed that Friday evening, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing for years. I had finally seen my family clearly, without the filters of hope and wishful thinking that had obscured their true nature for so long. I had finally understood the difference between being loved and being used, between being valued and being taken for granted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as my children escalated their campaign to reclaim their inheritance. But tonight, I could rest peacefully knowing that I had allies I could trust, a lawyer who would protect my interests, and a granddaughter who would carry forward the values I had tried to model. The woman who had been excluded from Thanksgiving was no longer fighting alone. And the family that had underestimated her was about to learn that when you corner someone with nothing left to lose, you might discover that they have more power than you ever imagined. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability that comes before momentous events. I woke before dawn, not from anxiety, but from anticipation, knowing that today would mark the end of one chapter in my life and the beginning of another. The final documents from Harold had arrived by courier on Saturday, and they now sat in my safe, waiting to reshape the future of everyone who had taken my generosity for granted. I spent the early hours in my garden, tending to the winter preparations that would protect my plants through the harsh months ahead. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, the methodical care required to ensure survival and eventual renewal. As I wrapped the more delicate shrubs in burlap and mulched the flower beds, I reflected on how my own life was undergoing a similar process of protection and preparation for rebirth. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was spending what might be my last peaceful morning in this garden, the sanctuary I had created through decades of careful planning and patient cultivation. By evening, my children would know the truth about their inheritance, and this estate might become a battlefield rather than a haven. But I had made my choice, and I was prepared for whatever consequences followed. At exactly 9 o'clock, I called James, Linda, and Robert, using the same conference call arrangement I had employed the previous week. This time, however, there was no confusion in their voices when they answered. They had been expecting this call, preparing for it, strategizing their responses to whatever ultimatum they assumed I was about to deliver. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm and businesslike. "I wanted to speak to all of you together because what I have to say affects everyone equally." "Mom," James interrupted, his tone taking on the patronizing quality he used when he thought he was managing a difficult situation. "Before you say anything, I want you to know that we've all been talking, and we understand that you're upset about Thanksgiving. We get it. We should have handled things differently." It was a masterpiece of non-apology, acknowledging upset without accepting responsibility, admitting poor handling without specifying what had been handled poorly. James had clearly been coached in this response, probably by Patricia, who understood the art of appearing conciliatory while conceding nothing of substance. "We've decided," Linda chimed in, her voice artificially bright, "to plan a big Christmas celebration at your house, just like the old days. We'll all come early and stay late, and you can cook all your traditional dishes. It'll be perfect. Perfect. They would grace me with their presence at my own home, allow me to cook for them and clean up after them. And in return, I would presumably restore their financial support and forget about their months of neglect." It was the kind of transaction they had always found satisfactory, minimal effort from them in exchange for maximum benefit from me. "And Mom," Robert added, his voice thick with manufactured emotion, "I want you to know that I've learned my lesson. I'm ready to be more responsible, to make better decisions. I just need one more chance to prove myself to you." One more chance. The phrase he had used dozens of times over the years, always accompanied by promises of change that lasted exactly as long as it took for my check to clear. Robert had apparently decided that his mother's devastating financial cutoff could be reversed with the same combination of guilt and false hope that had worked so many times before. I listened to their carefully orchestrated presentation, noting the coordination in their responses, the practiced quality of their remorse, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that their behavior might have been fundamentally wrong rather than simply tactically inappropriate. "Are you finished?" I asked when their chorus of promises and explanations finally ended. There was a moment of uncertain silence, as if they weren't sure whether they had said enough to achieve their objective, or whether more convincing was required. "Mom," James said carefully, "we hope you can find it in your heart to forgive us and move forward as a family." "I have some news for you," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Last week I finalized some changes to my estate planning that I think you should know about." I could almost hear them leaning forward, their attention sharpening as they prepared to learn about adjustments to their inheritance, modifications to the trust structures, perhaps new conditions on their access to the family fortune. Effective. Immediately, none of you are beneficiaries of my will. The Chen Development Group, all properties, investments, life insurance policies, and liquid assets will be transferred upon my death to the Richard and Margaret Chen Foundation for Educational Excellence. The silence that followed was so complete that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. No one spoke. No one even seemed to be breathing, as the magnitude of what I had just announced settled into their consciousness. Linda was the first to break. "What do you mean none of us are beneficiaries? That's impossible. You can't just give away the family business." "I can, and I have," I replied calmly. "The business was never the family business. It was my business. Richard started it, but I built it into what it is today. Every major decision, every strategic investment, every expansion that created the current value was my choice, my work, my achievement. But it's our inheritance, Robert said, his voice rising with panic. It's supposed to go to your children. That's how families work. Inheritance is supposed to go to people who have earned it through loyalty, respect, and contribution to the family's welfare, I corrected. You've spent decades taking from this family without giving anything back except demands for more. James found his voice, and it was tight with barely controlled rage. You can't be serious. You're going to give $47 million. To strangers because we hurt your feelings about one vacation? I'm going to give $47 million to young people who understand the value of hard work, who appreciate opportunities when they're given, and who will use their education to contribute something meaningful to society. Everything. You three have proven you will never do. The explosion was immediate and overwhelming. All three of them began talking at once, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of outrage, disbelief, and desperation. James was demanding to know if this was legally binding. Linda was sobbing that I was destroying her life. Robert was pleading for me to reconsider, promising that he would change, that they would all change, that they would be the children I wanted them to be. Stop, I said, and something in my tone cut through their panic. I'm not finished. They fell silent again, though I could hear Linda crying in the background. There is one exception to this disinheritance. Jessica will receive a substantial trust fund that will pay for her graduate education and provide her with financial security while she pursues her career in social work. She has demonstrated the character, work ethic, and values that I had hoped to see in my own children. Jessica? James sputtered. You're leaving money to Jessica but not to us? She's just a kid who doesn't understand anything about the real world. Jessica is 22 years old, working part-time to pay for her education, volunteering at homeless shelters, and planning a career devoted to helping others. She understands more about the real world than any of you have learned in your entire adult lives. This is insane, Patricia's voice came through James's phone, shrill with fury. You're punishing us for one mistake by destroying our children's future. What about the twins? What about their college funds, their security? The twins will receive the same opportunity that Jessica received, the chance to earn their own way, to develop their own character, to prove their own worth. If they grow up to be contributing members of society, they'll be welcome to apply for scholarships from the foundation. If they grow up to be like their parents, they'll learn to live without money they didn't earn. Linda's sobs grew louder. Mom, please, you can't do this to us. We made a mistake, but we're your children. Doesn't that mean anything? Being my children gave you advantages that most people never receive, I replied. Excellent educations, financial security, business opportunities, social connections. You've had every possible benefit of being Margaret Chen's children except 1. You never learned that privileges come with responsibilities. What responsibilities? Robert demanded. What did we fail to do? The question was so genuinely bewildered that it crystallized everything I had been trying to explain for weeks. Robert literally could not conceive of what he owed to the gay woman who had funded his entire adult life. What obligations might come with being the son of someone who had sacrificed her own dreams to build his security? You failed to include me in your lives except when you needed my money, I said. You failed to show interest in my thoughts, my feelings, my hopes, my concerns. You failed to treat me with the basic respect that you would show to any other human being who had done for you what I have done. We love you, Linda protested weakly. You love what I can provide for you. There's a difference, and it's a difference that your grandmother understood when she decided to leave her money to charity, rather than to her ungrateful children. This reference to family history seemed to shock them into temporary silence. My mother-in-law had indeed disinherited Richard's siblings after years of their financial exploitation and emotional neglect, establishing a scholarship fund that still operated today. Richard had supported his mother's decision, understanding that some lessons could only be taught through consequences. "How long have you been planning this?" James asked, his voice hollow with defeat. "I've been considering it for years, but I made the final decision the day you called to tell me about your wonderful family vacation that I wasn't invited to attend. That was the moment I realized that you didn't need me in your lives. You only needed my money." "We need you," Robert said desperately. "We've always needed you." "No, Robert. You've always used me. And now, you're going to learn the difference between need and want, between dependence and relationship, between taking and earning." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, cycling through anger, bargaining, and despair as each of my children attempted to find some argument that might change my mind. James threatened legal action. Linda promised dramatic changes in behavior. Robert offered to work for free at the company until he had proven his worth. Patricia suggested family therapy to resolve our communication issues. But I had heard all of these promises before, in various forms and circumstances, whenever my children had faced consequences for their choices. They were expert at crisis management, at finding the right combination of guilt, manipulation, and false hope to restore the status quo. What they had never learned was how to prevent crises through consistent good behavior. "The decision is final," I said when their arguments began repeating themselves. "The documents have been signed and filed. Your inheritance is gone, and no amount of pleading or threatening will bring it back." "So that's it?" James asked bitterly. 43 years of being your son, and it all ends because we went on vacation without you? 43 years of being your mother, and it all ended when you decided that I was too inconvenient to include in your family celebrations, but not too inconvenient to fund your lifestyle. I ended the call without saying goodbye. Within minutes, my phone began ringing again. James called back immediately, then Linda, then Robert, each leaving increasingly frantic voicemails as they processed the reality of what had just happened. Patricia called to scream about legal challenges and family destruction. Marcus called to express his support for my decision and his intention to divorce Linda if she moved back east to harass me. I listened to none of the voicemails completely. I had said everything I needed to say, and there was nothing left to discuss. The consequences were now in motion, and my children would have to learn to live with the choices they had made. Tuesday brought the first wave of their counterattack. Harold called to warn me that James had retained a high-powered estate attorney and was preparing to challenge my mental competency. Linda had contacted a private investigator to research my recent activities for evidence of undue influence or coercion. Robert had threatened to go to the media with a story about an elderly woman manipulated into disinheriting her loving family. "None of these approaches will succeed," Harold assured me. "Your mental state is clearly sound. There's no evidence of outside influence, and media attention would only highlight their own questionable behavior. But you should be prepared for an unpleasant few months while they exhaust their legal options." Wednesday brought visits from two private investigators, both working for Linda's attorney, who attempted to interview Elena about my recent behavior and mental state. Elena handled them with magnificent dignity, explaining that Mrs. Chen was the most capable employer she had ever worked for, and that anyone questioning her mental fitness obviously didn't know her very well. Thursday brought a surprise supporter in the form of Catherine, my sister-in-law, who called to apologize for her earlier conversation and to express her admiration for my courage. "Margaret," Catherine said, her voice warm with sincerity, "I've been thinking about our conversation all week, and I realized that I didn't understand the situation at all. After talking to some other family members and hearing more details about how the children have been behaving, I want you to know that I think you're doing exactly the right thing. What changed your mind?" "I talked to my nephew David. You remember Richard's brother's son, and he told me some things about James's behavior at family gatherings that I hadn't heard before. Apparently, James has been telling people for years that he's essentially running the company already, that you're just a figurehead who signs the papers he puts in front of you. This news didn't surprise me, but it confirmed that James's disrespect wasn't limited to private family interactions. He had been undermining my authority and claiming credit for my work in social settings as well, building a narrative that positioned him as the real power behind the Chen empire. David also mentioned that Linda has been selling some of the jewelry you gave her over the years, claiming that it was her inheritance anyway, and that she might as well get some use out of it while she was still young enough to enjoy the money. This revelation was more painful because it represented not just financial exploitation, but the destruction of sentimental gifts that had been chosen with love and given with hope for our future relationship. Margaret, I want you to know that not everyone in the extended family thinks you're wrong. Some of us have been wondering for years why you continued to support children who showed so little appreciation for your sacrifices. Catherine's call was followed by similar conversations with other relatives who had observed my children's behavior from the outside and had formed opinions that were remarkably consistent with my own assessments. It seemed that everyone except me had recognized the dysfunction in my family relationships, but no one had felt comfortable addressing it directly. Friday afternoon brought the most significant development yet. Jessica called to tell me that she had spoken with her parents about my decision and wanted me to know how they had reacted. Grandmother, I need to tell you something that's going to be hard to hear, but I think you need to know the truth about what Dad and Mom are saying. I settled into my chair, preparing myself for whatever revelations Jessica felt compelled to share. When I told Dad that I supported your decision, he completely lost it. He said that you had obviously been manipulated by your lawyer or your accountant, that no rational person would disinherit their children over a family vacation. He said that I was too young to understand the implications of what was happening. Jessica's voice was steady, but I could hear the pain underneath her calm reporting. Then Mom said something that really shocked me. She said that they had been discussing your mental state for months, that they were worried about your judgment and your ability to manage your affairs. She said that this inheritance decision proved that you needed to be in assisted living, where professionals could make sure you weren't taken advantage of. The casual cruelty of Patricia's assessment took my breath away. According to this narrative, my decision to control my own money was evidence that I was incompetent to control my own money, and the solution was to place me in an institution where others would make my decisions for me. Grandmother, I told them that you seemed sharper and more focused than I'd ever seen you, that your reasoning was completely clear and logical. But Dad said that family loyalty was more important than logic, that children were supposed to inherit their parents' wealth regardless of their behavior. Family loyalty. The concept that my children invoked only when it served their interests, that they interpreted as flowing only in one direction, that they had abandoned the moment it required any sacrifice from them. What did you tell them, Jessica? I told them that if they wanted family loyalty, they should have shown some to you. I told them that excluding you from Thanksgiving and then expecting to inherit your money was the most disloyal thing I could imagine. I told them that I was ashamed to be related to people who could treat their mother that way. Jessica's courage in confronting her own parents on my behalf was both moving and troubling. I didn't want this remarkable young woman to damage her relationships with her family because of my decisions, but I was grateful to know that at least one person in the younger generation understood the principles at stake. How did they respond to that? Dad said that I was being influenced by you, that you had manipulated me into taking your side against my own parents. Mom said that if I didn't support the family in challenging your decision, I would be just as responsible as you were for destroying everyone's future. The speed with which they had turned on Jessica, their willingness to characterize her independent moral judgment as manipulation, demonstrated the depths of their selfishness and their complete inability to accept responsibility for the consequences, of their actions. Jessica, I want you to know that you don't have to choose sides in this conflict. You can maintain relationships with your parents without endorsing their behavior toward me. Grandmother, they already made me choose when they demanded that I oppose you, and I've made my choice. I choose integrity over inheritance, respect over entitlement, love over money. That evening, I sat in my library with a glass of wine and Richard's photo, contemplating the events of the week and the path that had led to this moment. The man in the photograph had built a small construction business through hard work and honest dealing, never imagining that his widow would one day face the choice between enabling their children's selfishness and teaching them the values he had tried to model. I wondered what Richard would think of my decision. Would he approve of disinheriting the children we had raised together, or would he urge me to find some middle ground that preserved family unity while addressing their behavior? I suspected that Richard, who had supported his own mother's decision to disinherit his siblings, would understand that some lessons could only be taught through loss. The phone rang, interrupting my reflections. The caller ID showed Harold's number, and I answered expecting some update on the legal challenges my children were mounting. Margaret, Harold said, his voice unusually serious, I need to tell you about a conversation I had today with James's attorney, Jeffrey Whitman. He's asked for a meeting to discuss what he called a reasonable resolution to the inheritance dispute. What kind of resolution? Whitman suggested that you might be willing to restore the children to your will in exchange for some behavioral modifications on their part. He mentioned regular family dinners, mandatory attendance at holiday gatherings, perhaps some involvement in charitable activities that would demonstrate their commitment to the family values you want to see. I considered this proposal, trying to imagine James, Linda, and Robert dutifully performing the rituals of family devotion in exchange for restoration of their inheritance. It would be a hollow pantomime, a business transaction disguised as emotional reconciliation, a series of obligations fulfilled for financial reward rather than love. Harold, if someone pays you to spend time with them, are they buying companionship or purchasing a service? They're purchasing a service, he replied immediately. And if someone modifies their behavior to preserve their inheritance, are they demonstrating love or protecting their investment? They're protecting their investment. Then Mr. Whitman's proposal is essentially asking me to purchase my children's affection rather than inspiring their genuine care. I'm not interested in renting a family, Harold. I'd rather be alone with dignity than surrounded by people who are only there for the money. Harold was quiet for a moment before responding. I'll convey your position to Mr. Whitman, but Margaret, I want you to prepare yourself for what comes next. When they realize that negotiation isn't going to work, they're going to escalate to more aggressive tactics. What kind of tactics? Competency challenges are notoriously difficult to prove, but they can be emotionally devastating to endure. They'll bring in psychiatrists who will testify about your supposed mental decline based on hypothetical scenarios. They'll parade witnesses who will claim to have observed concerning behavior. They'll argue that no rational person would make the decisions you've made. And how long will this process take? Months, possibly years. And during that time, your relationships with your children will deteriorate further as the legal battle becomes more public and more bitter. I thanked Harold for his warning and hung up, understanding that the easy part of this confrontation was now over. My children had received the news of their disinheritance, had attempted negotiation and found it unsuccessful, and were now preparing for total war. They would attack my mental capacity, my judgment, my relationships, and my reputation in their effort to reclaim the inheritance they had never earned. But they had made a fundamental miscalculation in their strategy. They assumed that I would be devastated by their rejection, crushed by their legal challenges, isolated by their campaign to portray me as mentally unstable. They assumed that I needed their approval, their presence, their acceptance more than I needed my dignity and self-respect. They were wrong. I had spent 72 years learning to be strong, and the last few weeks had taught me that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. I had built a business empire, raised 3 children, survived the death of my husband, and created a legacy that would benefit generations of deserving young people. I had allies who respected me, resources to defend myself, and a clear conscience about the choices I had made. My children could challenge my will, question my sanity, and wage whatever legal battles they chose. But they could no longer manipulate me with guilt, control me with obligation, or exploit me with false promises of change. They had excluded me from their Thanksgiving celebration because they thought I was powerless to respond. Tomorrow, they would begin learning just how powerful a woman with nothing left to lose could actually be. 6 months after the inheritance revelation, I stood in the conference room of Hartford's most prestigious law firm, watching my children's attorney deliver his final arguments in what had become known locally as the Chen family competency case. Jeffrey Whitman was an expensive lawyer with a reputation for winning impossible cases, but today his usually confident demeanor showed cracks of desperation as he struggled to present evidence that simply didn't exist. "Your Honor," Whitman said, gesturing toward a stack of documents that represented 6 months of investigation into my personal life, "the petitioners maintain that Mrs. Chen's decision to disinherit her children represents a radical departure from her established pattern of family devotion, suggesting cognitive decline or undue influence." Judge Sarah Morrison, a woman in her 60s who had built her career on methodical analysis of complex estate disputes, reviewed the materials with the thoroughness that had made her one of the most respected probate judges in Connecticut. She had already spent 3 days listening to testimony from psychiatrists, financial experts, and family members, and her expression suggested she was unimpressed by what she had heard. The proceedings had been a masterclass in legal desperation. James had testified that I had become increasingly irrational over the past year, though he couldn't provide specific examples beyond my decision to cut off his funding. Linda had sobbed on the witness stand about my sudden coldness toward the family, though her cross-examination revealed that she hadn't visited me voluntarily in over 2 years. Robert had claimed that I was being manipulated by outside influences, though he couldn't identify who those influences might be or how they had gained access to me. Patricia had been their star witness, presenting herself as a concerned daughter-in-law who had noticed troubling changes in my behavior. She described my Thanksgiving dinner preparations as obsessive, my financial decisions as reckless, and my relationship with Jessica as inappropriately dependent. Under cross-examination, however, she had been forced to admit that she had attempted to bribe my housekeeper for false testimony and had conducted unauthorized searches of my personal belongings. The parade of expert witnesses had been equally unconvincing. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the geriatric psychiatrist Patricia, had originally tried to recruit, had refused to participate after learning the true circumstances of the case. The psychiatrists who did testify had never examined me personally, basing their opinions on hypothetical scenarios and secondhand reports from family members with obvious financial incentives to lie. Harold had countered with our own evidence, and it was devastating in its clarity. Financial records showed that my business decisions over the past year had been consistently profitable and strategically sound. Medical records confirmed that my physical and mental health were excellent for someone my age. Character witnesses, including Elena, Catherine, Marcus, and several business associates, testified to my continued sharpness, emotional stability, and rational decision-making. But it was Jessica's testimony that had truly destroyed my children's case. She had taken the stand with quiet dignity and methodically dismantled every claim about my mental state, my family relationships, and my decision-making process. She had provided specific examples of conversations that demonstrated my clear thinking, described interactions that showed my emotional stability, and explained the logical progression of events that had led to my inheritance decision. Mrs. Chen didn't exclude my father and aunt and uncle from her will because she was confused, Jessica had said, looking directly at Judge Morrison. She excluded them because she finally understood who they really were. And that understanding wasn't the result of mental illness. It was the result of mental clarity. The cross-examination of Jessica had been a disaster for Whitman. When he suggested that I had manipulated her into supporting my position, she had responded with devastating precision. "Mr. Whitman, my grandmother didn't need to manipulate me. She just needed to tell me the truth about how my family had been treating her. The truth was manipulation enough." Now, as Whitman made his closing argument, I could see that he knew. He was fighting a losing battle. The evidence simply didn't support his client's claims, and Judge Morrison's questions throughout the proceedings had indicated deep skepticism about their motives. "The respondent," Whitman continued, "asks this court to ignore a lifetime of family devotion and financial generosity based on one emotional decision made in response to a trivial misunderstanding." Harold rose for his closing argument with the confidence of someone who held all the winning cards. "Your Honor, the petitioners would have this court believe that a woman who built a $47 million business empire, who has demonstrated consistent sound judgment in complex financial matters, who continues to manage her affairs with remarkable competence, is suddenly incompetent to decide how her own money should be distributed after her death." He paused, letting the absurdity of that argument settle in the courtroom. But this case isn't really about competency. It's about entitlement. The petitioners believed they were entitled to inherit wealth they never earned, and when that entitlement was removed, they chose to attack their mother's mental capacity rather than examine their own behavior. Harold gestured toward the financial records spread across the table. "Mrs. Chen's decision to establish an educational foundation isn't evidence of mental decline. It's evidence of wisdom. She recognized that her wealth would be better used to help deserving young people achieve their potential than to enable the continued dependence of adults who had shown no appreciation for her decades of sacrifice." Judge Morrison called for a brief recess before delivering her ruling. During those 30 minutes, I sat quietly in the courtroom while my children huddled with their attorney, their faces showing the strain of 6 months of legal warfare that had cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars and revealed their true characters to the entire Hartford legal community. Linda had aged years during the proceedings, her artistic pretensions crumbling under the weight of financial reality. She had been forced to take a job at an art supply store to pay her rent, and the experience of earning her own money had apparently been both humbling and educational. Marcus had indeed filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, but had privately told me that Linda was slowly beginning to understand the value of work and self-reliance. Robert had surprised everyone by flourishing without my financial support. After losing his food truck, he had taken a job as a line cook at a respected restaurant and had discovered a genuine talent for culinary arts. He was saving money to attend culinary school and had stopped asking for loans or making promises he couldn't keep. The crisis had forced him to grow up, and the results were encouraging. James had fared the worst, both financially and emotionally. Without the inflated salary and investment funding he had been receiving from the company, he had been forced to confront the reality of his actual value in the business world. He had taken a position with a competing firm at a fraction of his previous compensation, and the experience had been a brutal education in market-based performance evaluation. Patricia had thrown herself into the legal challenge with vindictive enthusiasm, apparently believing that destroying my reputation would somehow restore their inheritance. But the proceedings had exposed her manipulative nature to public scrutiny, and her social standing in their affluent community had suffered accordingly. When court resumed, Judge Morrison delivered a ruling that was both comprehensive and decisive. "After reviewing all evidence presented," she began, "this court finds no credible basis for the petitioner's claims regarding Mrs. Chen's mental competency. The psychiatric evaluations conducted for this proceeding confirm that Mrs. Chen possesses full cognitive capacity and decision-making ability. Her business judgment remains sound. Her personal relationships are appropriate and healthy, and her reasoning regarding her estate plan is both rational and well-articulated. The judge's voice took on a stern tone as she continued. Furthermore, this court is disturbed by evidence of the petitioner's attempts to manufacture testimony through bribery and coercion. Such behavior raises serious questions about their own judgment and character. She looked directly at my children as she delivered the final blow. Mrs. Chen's decision to redirect her wealth toward educational philanthropy rather than family inheritance reflects values that this court finds admirable rather than concerning. The petitioner's challenge to this decision appears to be motivated by financial self-interest rather than genuine concern for Mrs. Chen's welfare. The ruling was everything Harold had hoped for and everything my children had feared. Not only had their competency challenge failed completely, but Judge Morrison's comments created a public record of their questionable behavior that would follow them indefinitely. As we left the courthouse, I felt a profound sense of closure. The legal vindication was satisfying, but more important was the knowledge that I had successfully defended my right to control my own legacy. My children had thrown everything they had at me: legal challenges, character assassination, emotional manipulation, and they had failed utterly. Jessica was waiting for me on the courthouse steps, having taken time off from her graduate studies to attend the final hearing. She hugged me tightly, her relief evident in her trembling voice. "I'm so proud of you, grandmother," she said. "You stood up for yourself when everyone said you couldn't win." That evening, as I sat in my library with a glass of champagne to celebrate the victory, I reflected on everything that had changed since that phone call about Thanksgiving exclusion. I had lost my children as I had known them, but I had gained something far more valuable: my self-respect and the knowledge that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. The Richard and Margaret Chen Foundation was already operational, having awarded its first round of scholarships to deserving students who understood the value of education and opportunity. Jessica served on the selection committee, bringing the same integrity and wisdom to philanthropic work that she brought to everything else in her life. My relationship with my children remained strained but was slowly evolving. Robert had called several times to apologize and to share updates about his culinary progress. He wasn't asking for money or making promises. He was simply trying to rebuild a relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Linda had written a letter acknowledging that she had taken my support for granted and expressing hope that we might eventually find a way to connect as mother and daughter rather than as benefactor and dependent. The letter was thoughtful and genuine, suggesting that the shock of losing her inheritance had prompted some authentic self-reflection. James remained angry and defiant, apparently still believing that his mother owed him wealth regardless of how he treated her. Patricia had doubled down on her narrative of family betrayal, seemingly unable to accept that her manipulation had backfired so completely. But even their continued hostility couldn't diminish my satisfaction with the choices I had made. 6 months later, I received a call that brought the entire saga full circle. Jessica was calling to invite me to spend Thanksgiving with her and several of her graduate school friends who couldn't travel home for the holiday. "It won't be fancy," Jessica said. "Just a potluck dinner in my apartment with people who genuinely want to be together." "But grandmother, I can't think of anyone I'd rather share the holiday with than you." The invitation was everything that my children's exclusion had not been: genuine, heartfelt, and based on desire for my company, rather than obligation or expectation of benefit. I accepted immediately, understanding that this would be my first real Thanksgiving in years, celebrated with people who valued my presence rather than my presence. As I prepared for that dinner, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. I had been excluded from my family's Thanksgiving because they thought I was powerless to respond. They had learned that the woman they underestimated was capable of excluding them from something far more valuable than a single holiday meal. They had lost $47 million because they couldn't find room for their mother at their dinner table. It was a lesson in consequences that would last the rest of their lives, and a reminder that love, respect, and family loyalty should never be taken for granted. The woman who had been deemed too inconvenient for a family vacation had proven that she was far too valuable to be treated with anything less than the respect she deserved. And now, surrounded by people who appreciated her for who she was rather than what she could provide, she was finally home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.